Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the hushed streets of medieval London, where mist gathers between timbered houses and the soft glow of lanterns trembles against damp stone. The city rests uneasy beneath its curfew bell, its alleys alive with quiet footsteps and the whisper of watchmen calling the hours. Listen for the faint clatter of wooden clappers, the sigh of wind through narrow lanes, and the steady rhythm of lives lived in darkness. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. London in the Middle Ages was not the glittering capital we picture now. Forget red buses and glass skyscrapers. Instead, imagine narrow, crooked alleys, barely wide enough for two people to pass without rubbing shoulders. And not in a cute romantic way, but in the "oh no, did that man just sneeze plague droplets on me" way. Houses leaned over the street so far they practically kissed each other, and every open space was filled with livestock, vendors, and people who hadn't bathed in a while, which was most people. But when the sun went down, the whole place changed, and that's where the Nightwatch came in. These were the unsung, unpaid, usually quite unwilling guardians of the sleeping city. Their job, walk around with a lantern, shout things into the darkness, and try to keep everyone from robbing, stabbing, or accidentally setting the whole city on fire. A noble task, except of course, it was usually performed by random householders who'd rather be in bed. You see, the medieval Nightwatch wasn't some elite group of professional guards. No, that would have made sense. Instead, every able-bodied man in a ward or neighborhood was expected to take turns patrolling at night. Think of it like jury duty, except instead of sitting in a courtroom pretending to listen, you had to trudge around damp streets at 2 a.m. hoping you wouldn't step in something unspeakable. And yes, people tried to get out of it. Constantly. Because let's be real, if you were a wealthy merchant, the last thing you wanted was to spend your night holding a wooden rattle and shivering in the fog, when you could pay someone else to do it. So they did. Wealthier men often hired substitutes, usually poorer folks who were desperate enough to risk a few stabbings in exchange for coin. Now, what exactly did the Nightwatch do? Well, first of all, they carried lanterns. These weren't the kind of bright, reassuring lanterns you see in movies. More like a sad little flame inside a horn casing that smoked and sputtered if you looked at it funny. Still, it was better than stumbling around in complete darkness, which, given medieval London's potholes, open sewers and occasional dead animals, was a real hazard. Their second duty was shouting the hours. Yes, the medieval version of an alarm clock was a man wandering by your house yelling, 2 o'clock, and all's well, except it often wasn't well. Fires were common, fights broke out, and thieves had a habit of testing just how awake the watchmen really were. But the tradition of shouting persisted, probably more to prove they were still awake themselves than to reassure anyone else. And let's pause here for a moment to appreciate how much shouting defined medieval city life. Bells rang constantly. Town criers bellowed out news. Vendors screamed about their eels or pies or whatever mystery meat they were hawking. And then, at night, the watchmen added their chorus. So really, if you lived in London back then, sleeping through noise was an essential survival skill. Think of it like living next to an airport, except the planes are yelling at you personally. But fire prevention, now that was serious business. London was basically a tinderbox. The houses were timber, the roofs thatched, and everyone had a fireplace or candles burning. One small spark, and suddenly you've got an inferno racing through the city, so the Nightwatch had to keep their eyes open for any suspicious glows. If they saw smoke, they'd rattle their wooden clappers to alert people. Yes, clappers, basically 2 pieces of wood slapped together. Not exactly cutting-edge firefighting technology, but it was what they had. And if you're wondering, no, they did not carry water buckets or hoses. That would have been far too practical. The standard procedure was more along the lines of yell loudly, wake up everyone nearby, and hope the neighbors formed a bucket line before the entire street burned down. Medieval London's official fire strategy could be summarized as panic early, panic often. Now, the watch also had to deal with curfew. Yes, a literal curfew. The bells rang at 9 or 10, depending on the era, and after that, you were supposed to stay indoors. Taverns had to close, markets packed up, and everyone was expected to go home. The idea was that nothing good happens after dark, which, to be fair, is mostly true in a city without streetlights. But naturally, people ignored this rule, especially students, drunkards, and anyone who thought sneaking out was more fun than sleeping. So the watch would sometimes stop late-night wanderers and ask them what they were doing. If you couldn't come up with a good excuse, you might be thrown in the local cage or the stocks until morning, which sounds humiliating. But honestly, some people probably preferred sleeping it off outdoors rather than trudging home in the dark. Speaking of dark, let's talk about crime. London, at night, was not exactly safe. Pickpockets, burglars, and gangs roamed the streets, because of course they did. The watch was supposed to deter them, but remember, these were not trained fighters. If a group of thugs appeared, the average watchman's instinct was probably less heroic showdown, and more suddenly fascinated by this interesting wall over here. Still, their mere presence sometimes kept trouble at bay, and we can't ignore the supernatural side of things. People in medieval London genuinely believed that ghosts, demons, and other creatures prowled at night, so part of the watcher's role was almost symbolic, showing that the city wasn't abandoned to the dark. Imagine trying to patrol your neighborhood with only a lantern, while half the town believes you might bump into a literal demon. I don't know about you, but I'd be rattling those clappers very loudly, just in case. Of course, the city authorities tried to regulate the watch with various ordinances. There were rules about how many men had to patrol, what equipment they carried, and how often they switched shifts. In practice, though, it was chaotic. Some nights, only a handful of men showed up. Other nights, they all got drunk together instead of patrolling. There are records of watchmen being fined for sleeping on duty, abandoning their post, or my personal favorite, getting into fights with each other. Truly, the protectors of the night. Now, one detail that often gets overlooked is just how cold and miserable these patrols could be. London nights were damp, foggy, and bone-chilling, especially in winter. There were no thermal jackets or hot coffee to keep you going, just a wool cloak, thin shoes, and maybe some ale if you were lucky. So it's not surprising that watchmen sometimes huddled together in doorways, trying not to freeze. Romantic in theory, miserable in practice. And yet, despite the flaws, the Nightwatch did matter. They were the backbone of what little security medieval London had. Without them, fires might rage unchecked, thieves would run wild, and the streets would be even more terrifying than they already were. It was far from a perfect system, but it kept the city functioning. As time went on, the Nightwatch evolved. By the 14th and 15th centuries, London experimented with hiring more permanent staff men who actually did this regularly, instead of reluctantly taking turns. Think of it as the earliest form of professional policing. But even then, they weren't exactly Scotland Yard material. More like your grumpy uncle with a lantern and a stick, told to make himself useful. And that's the thing. Life in medieval London wasn't about perfection. It was about getting by with what you had. The Nightwatch didn't prevent every crime or every fire, but they gave people a sense that someone was out there, keeping an eye on things, even if that someone was half asleep, muttering about how cold it was, and occasionally mistaking a cat for a burglar. So, if you're drifting off to sleep right now, maybe imagine yourself as a watchman on duty. You're trudging through the misty streets, clapper in hand, lantern swinging. You pass shuttered houses, hear a dog bark in the distance. Maybe smell bread baking in a late-night oven. You mutter, 2 o'clock and all's well, even though you're not entirely sure it is. And then you keep walking, because that's all you can do. Just keep walking through the dark until the sun comes up and someone else takes your place. So, let's drift away now from the damp cobblestones of medieval London nights and into something a little warmer, a little more caffeinated, and a whole lot more talkative. Welcome to the coffeehouses of 17th and 18th century London, otherwise known as the places where Enlightenment men went to pretend they were cleverer than they actually were. Now, before you get too cozy with your modern latte in hand, remember, coffee in the 1600s was not the frothy, sugary dessert in a cup situation we call coffee today. There were no caramel drizzle macchiatos, no oat milk flat whites, no pumpkin spice. Any coffee then was a strong, bitter, slightly burnt liquid poured from a questionable pot that had probably been used since Charles II was in diapers. People didn't sip it for taste, they drank it because it was new, it was exotic, and most importantly, it kept you awake long enough to argue with strangers about politics. London's first coffeehouse opened in the 1650s, and by the early 1700s there were hundreds of them. Each one was crammed into a dim, smoky little room, smelling like a mix of ink, pipe tobacco, wet wool coats, and the aforementioned bitter brew. If you're picturing cozy cafes with rustic charm, don't. Imagine instead a crowded, noisy space where everyone talks at once. The tables are sticky, and the only available seat is next to some guy loudly reading a pamphlet he clearly wrote himself. And here's the best part. Admission was basically the price of 1 penny. For a single coin, you got entry into this chaotic intellectual playground. That's why they were sometimes called penny universities, a lovely marketing spin on what was essentially pay 1 penny to eavesdrop on men arguing about taxes until midnight. Who were these men, exactly? Well, pretty much anyone who could scrape together a penny and endure the bitterness of early modern coffee. Merchants, writers, lawyers, scientists, pamphleteers, gossip mongers, aspiring revolutionaries. Basically the kind of crowd that today would all be running anonymous Twitter accounts. The king hated them. Clergymen hated them. Wives especially hated them, because their husbands would disappear for hours and come back with nothing but political ranting and coffee breath. In fact, wives were so annoyed that in 1674, a satirical pamphlet appeared called the Women's Petition Against Coffee. It complained that men were spending too much time in coffee houses, losing their vigor and coming home weak and distracted, which of course the men immediately responded to with their own pamphlet defending coffee. So yes, even in the 17th century, gender wars were fought via badly written think pieces. Inside, the atmosphere was both democratic and chaotic. Everyone sat at long communal tables, strangers and friends alike, and you could, in theory, talk to anyone. Rank and class blurred a little in here, which was shocking in a society obsessed with hierarchy. A nobleman might sit beside a merchant, a bookseller next to a lawyer. Everyone had the right to speak, though of course some people spoke more loudly and for much longer than anyone wanted them to. The conversations ranged from business deals to philosophy to, inevitably, conspiracy theories. Because what is a public gathering without someone whispering that the king is secretly in league with the French, or that papists are about to invade? In fact, the government was so alarmed by coffeehouse chatter that Charles II once tried to ban them entirely, declaring them hotbeds of sedition. This, naturally, backfired instantly. Londoners rioted at the thought of losing their coffee fix, and the ban was quietly dropped within days. You'd think Charles might have learned that banning caffeine never ends well, but coffeehouses weren't just gossip dens. They were also hubs of information. Newspapers were still new, expensive, and sometimes censored, but coffeehouses often kept a few copies lying around. People would read them aloud for the room, adding their own commentary, of course. Pamphlets circulated, news sheets, even handwritten newsletters. It was like the early internet, messy, unreliable, but thrilling. If you wanted to know what was happening in politics, trade, or scandal, you went to a coffeehouse, and much like the internet, each coffeehouse developed its own identity. Some specialized in trade and finance, attracting merchants and stock jobbers. Lloyd's Coffeehouse, for instance, became famous for shipping gossip, which eventually evolved into Lloyd's of London, the giant insurance market. Others catered to writers, scientists, or roaders. If you were into literature, you might haunt Will's Coffeehouse where John Dryden held court. If you were into science, you might show up at a place where members of the Royal Society argued about whether blood circulates clockwise or counterclockwise, or whatever weird debate they were having that week. And of course, there were always political haunts. Whig coffeehouses, Tory coffeehouses, Jacobite coffeehouses, all filled with men muttering conspiracies, plotting pamphlets, and occasionally slipping information to spies. Because naturally, if you get a bunch of ambitious men together, someone's going to end up whispering treason. Now, let's talk about the actual coffee itself. It was served black bitter and usually lukewarm. Sugar was an expensive luxury, milk wasn't standard, and cream was even rarer. So really, you were just drinking hot bitterness in a mug, while pretending it gave you intellectual superpowers. And maybe it did, compared to the alternative. Before coffeehouses, most people drank ale or small beer all day, even at breakfast. So switching to coffee meant suddenly you had sober people talking late into the night, instead of drunk people falling asleep in puddles. Coffee fueled an entire shift in how Europeans thought, wrote, and argued. But with sobriety came something else. Paranoia. Because if you get enough men sitting together in a smoky room with too much caffeine and not enough daylight, they will inevitably convince themselves the government is hiding something. Some coffee houses became known as breeding grounds for conspiracy theories. You could walk in for a quiet cup and leave convinced that the French were tunneling under the Channel, or that Jesuits had infiltrated the postal service. It didn't help that coffee houses were deeply male spaces. Women weren't banned outright, but they were rare inside, and when they did appear, it was usually as proprietors or servants. The whole scene was masculine, competitive, and a little performative. Everyone wanted to sound informed, or radical, which meant constant one-upmanship. Think less relaxing cafe and more loud debate club fueled by too much caffeine. Perfect bedtime listening I know. And while many people ranted and postured, a surprising amount of real business got done in coffee houses. Stock deals, insurance contracts, even newspaper ventures started there. Editors picked up stories, printers found material, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. Honestly, if you think Twitter spreads nonsense quickly, imagine a crowded room of men all shouting rumors at once, with no way to fact-check anything. By the time you finished your cup, half the city believed the Queen was pregnant with twins or that the Dutch fleet was sailing up the Thames. Now, let's float gently into a smaller detail, the coffeehouse penny. That tiny coin didn't just buy you a drink. It bought you access to knowledge, to debate, to a kind of proto-democracy. In a world where universities were closed to most people and books were expensive, the coffeehouse gave ordinary men a chance to join the conversation. Not equally, of course. This was still a society where wealth and connections mattered, but it cracked the door open just enough for new voices to slip through. And it wasn't only London. Paris had its own coffeehouses, famously buzzing with philosophers, writers, and revolutionaries. Voltaire practically lived on coffee, allegedly drinking dozens of cups a day, which probably explains both his productivity and his general crankiness. In Vienna, coffeehouses became cultural institutions, with people lingering for hours over chess and newspapers. But London's coffeehouses had their own peculiar flavor, half gossip parlor, half business exchange, half political underground. Yes, that's 3 halves. Coffeehouses never did math very well. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. Coffeehouses were not always pleasant. They were crowded, smelly, and noisy. The smoke was thick, the floors sticky, and fights broke out regularly. Some became notorious for pickpockets or unsavory characters. And yes, there were always those self-appointed intellectuals who never stopped talking. You know the type. The guy who's read half a pamphlet and now wants to explain the entire state of European politics to you whether you asked or not. Coffeehouses were full of them. Still, in their own chaotic way, they helped shape the Enlightenment. They created a space where ideas, good, bad, half-baked, could be shared. They made information more accessible. They encouraged debate, satire, pamphleteering, and all the messy chatter that eventually fueled revolutions. And they gave us the delightful historical image of wig-wearing men sipping bitter sludge while shouting at each other until dawn. So, if you're cozy in bed right now, maybe picture yourself sitting in a smoky 18th century coffee house. The tables are scratched and stained, the room smells of tobacco and damp wool, and the coffee in your cup is frankly terrible. But around you, men are arguing passionately about trade, about politics, about whether Newton or Leibniz invented calculus first. And even if half of it is nonsense, you can't help but feel that something important is happening. Ideas are spreading, connections forming, history quietly brewing in the background, all for the price of a single penny. So, we've wandered through the foggy nights of medieval London. We've sat in the smoky chaos of Enlightenment coffee houses. And now it's time to chew on something stranger. Tonight, let's talk about a form of medieval justice that involved bread, cheese, and the deeply questionable idea that God was moonlighting as a throat inspector. Yes, we're diving into the bizarre world of the ordeal of cheese and cake. Because why rely on evidence, testimony, or anything resembling common sense when you could just feed a suspect some food and see what happened? Welcome to medieval Europe. Now, trials in the Middle Ages weren't always the solemn courtroom dramas we imagine today. Sure, there were laws, charters, and judges in flowing robes. But when things got tricky, like when no one could agree who was guilty, People often turn to ordeals. These were tests meant to let God decide, because apparently the Almighty had nothing better to do than referee minor disputes about stolen goats or slandered neighbors. Some ordeals were dramatic. You might be told to plunge your hand into boiling water and see if it healed cleanly, or walk across hot irons without burning your feet, or my personal favorite, be thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but also possibly drowned. Justice was not exactly user-friendly. And then there was the culinary option. The ordeal of the morsel, sometimes called ordeal by consecrated bread and cheese. The premise was simple. You gave the accused a piece of bread and cheese that had been blessed by a priest. If they could swallow it smoothly, they were innocent. If they choked, coughed, or sputtered, it meant God had revealed their guilt. Congratulations, you just got convicted by dairy products. Let's pause here. Imagine being accused of theft in your small medieval village. Everyone gathers in the church. The priest solemnly blesses a chunk of bread and a wedge of cheese. You're told to eat. The crowd stares. Your throat is dry from nerves. Your hands are shaking, and suddenly that bite feels like sawdust. You cough once, and boom, you're guilty. Case closed. Honestly, medieval justice makes Twitter cancel culture look merciful. The origins of this ordeal go back to ancient ideas about oaths and sacred food. The thinking was, if you swore innocence before God and then ate holy bread and cheese, the truth would reveal itself physically. Guilt, apparently, caused instant indigestion. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but in a deeply religious society, the logic had weight. People genuinely believed God could and would use their body as a courtroom, and it wasn't just for petty theft. In some records, the ordeal of bread and cheese was used for serious accusations, sorcery, heresy, even treason, because nothing says high stakes like nibbling nervously on a slice of cheddar while your entire future hangs in the balance. The cheese wasn't always just ordinary cheese, either. Some accounts mention exomologus, a ritual where the bread and cheese were consecrated at the altar and treated almost like the Eucharist, which meant refusing the ordeal was suspicious too. If you said, "No thanks, I'm lactose intolerant," people didn't nod sympathetically. They thought, yes, clearly guilty. You couldn't win. There's also the issue of choking. Let's be honest, medieval food safety wasn't stellar. Bread was dense, cheese was hard, and nobody had a glass of water ready on the side. Add in a crowd staring at you, the anxiety of potential execution, and a dry throat. Yeah, lots of innocent people probably choked. Meanwhile, some smug thief with a strong gullet breezed through. Justice served, medieval style. One particularly amusing thing is how often the ordeal was mocked by later commentators. Even medieval writers themselves sometimes rolled their eyes at the idea that God had a vested interest in bread-based trials. Legal reforms in the 13th century gradually phased out ordeals, especially after the church officially withdrew its blessing from the practice. Apparently, even the priests got tired of playing gastro-judge. But before we leave the cheese ordeal behind, let's savor the atmosphere. Picture it, a small stone church, smoky from incense. Villagers packed shoulder to shoulder, eager for a bit of drama in their otherwise uneventful week. The accused, pale and sweating, stands before the priest. The morsel is blessed, placed reverently in trembling hands. Everyone leans in. A bite is taken. Silence. A cough. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Justice has spoken. or at least indigestion has. And here's a fun twist. It wasn't always bread and cheese. Some versions mention bread and cheesecake, which sounds almost pleasant until you realize it was probably just a heavy lump of baked dough with cheese mixed in. Not exactly a birthday treat. The word cake here doesn't mean fluffy sponge. It means dense, chewy, choke-worthy loaf. Perfect for high-stakes courtroom drama. What's fascinating is how this ordeal reflects the medieval obsession with blending the sacred and the mundane. Food wasn't just food, it was a channel for divine judgment. Eating became a test of faith, a ritual of truth. We moderns rely on fingerprints, DNA, CCTV footage. They relied on whether you could swallow without coughing, different times. And of course, there's the darker side. Imagine how easy it was to rig this ordeal. A priest could bless the food with a particularly stern prayer. A village rival could slip in some dry crumbs, or even a bit of ash, or the accused might just be so terrified they couldn't swallow. In other words, it wasn't justice. It was theater. Theater that decided lives. Still, ordeals like this remind us how much communities craved certainty. In a world without forensic science, without reliable records, people wanted a clear sign, and if that sign came in the form of cheese, well, better than endless disputes. At least everyone could nod and say, well, God has spoken, even if secretly half of them thought it was nonsense. The ordeal of cheese and cake faded out by the later Middle Ages, swept aside by more rational legal procedures. But its memory lingered in satire and folklore. Jokes about choking on holy bread popped up for centuries. Even today, the phrase feels surreal, like something Monty Python would invent, except it actually happened. So, if you're lying in bed drifting between wake and sleep, maybe picture yourself in that medieval church. You're handed a dense morsel of bread and cheese. The crowd waits. You chew, swallow carefully, and you pass. Relief floods you. For tonight, at least, your throat and your innocence remain intact. And if you doze off before the end of this story, don't worry, all's well. You've survived the medieval justice system, at least in your dreams. So we've walked the damp alleys with London's Nightwatch. We've sipped bitter coffee with Enlightenment gossips. We've nervously chewed through cheese-based justice. And now we arrive at something so bizarre that it almost sounds made up. A pope on trial. Not just any pope, a dead pope. Yes, welcome to the late 9th century and the deeply surreal fiasco known as the Cadaver Synod. Now, if you've ever thought modern politics is a circus, just be grateful you weren't alive in medieval Rome. Because back then, politics wasn't just dirty. It was occasionally dug up from the grave dirt, and the Catholic Church, which you might imagine as all incense and solemn hymns, was often knee-deep in backstabbing, scheming, and family feuds that would make Game of Thrones look restrained. Our story centers on Pope Formosus. His name alone is fun to say, like some sort of pasta dish. Formosus had been pope from 89 to 896, which doesn't sound like a long time, but in papal years it was an eternity. These were turbulent decades when popes came and went faster than new iPhone models. Formosus managed to survive in the papal chair for 5 whole years, which was practically a Guinness World Record. But here's the problem. He wasn't very popular with everyone. Shocking. I know, he had made enemies, particularly with a powerful Roman faction aligned with the Spalato family. Local aristocrats who had the bad habit of thinking they owned the papacy. Formosus had supported their rivals, which meant that after his death in 1896, they weren't about to let him rest in peace. Literally. Enter Pope Stephen VI, the unlucky man who inherited both the papal throne and the simmering grudges. Stephen wasn't exactly the brightest candle on the altar. He was, however, ambitious enough or desperate enough to side with the Spoltons. And they had an idea, a terrible, terrible idea. What if, they whispered, we put the late Pope Formosus on trial? Now, a sensible person might have said, that's insane. He's dead. But medieval Rome was not a place where sense thrived. Instead, Stephen agreed. Thus was born the Cadaver Synod of 1897, one of the most macabre farces in church history. Picture it. St. John Lateran Basilica in Rome. The grand cathedral, bishops gather, murmuring nervously. Pope Stephen presides, looking tense, and in the middle of it all, seated on a throne, dressed in papal robes, is the decomposing corpse of Formosus. They had dug him up, propped him upright, and even given him the papal staff to hold. Because apparently, if you're going to put a corpse on trial, you might as well dress him for the occasion. One can only imagine the smell. Rome was hot, embalming was rudimentary, and this was a body that had been in the ground for months. So while the official record says the trial began, the unrecorded truth is probably that half the court was trying not to gag. Still, they pressed on, since Formosus was not in a position to defend himself. They appointed a deacon to speak on his behalf. Imagine being that poor man. Your job is to stand next to a rotting pope and pretend to represent his legal defense. Not exactly the dream assignment. The charges were read: perjury, ambition, coveting the papacy, illegally breaking canon law by moving from one bishopric to another. Basically, they accused him of being shifty, power-hungry, and disobedient, which, to be fair, described about 90% of medieval clergy. But Formosus was the unlucky scapegoat. Stephen ranted at the corpse, pointing his finger dramatically, as if expecting a rebuttal. The deacon mumbled half-hearted defenses. The bishops, intimidated and probably nauseated, nodded along. The outcome was, of course, predetermined. The dead man was found guilty, and the punishment? Stripping Formosus of all papal dignity. His corpse was torn out of its robes. The 3 fingers he had used for blessings were cut off, and his body was declared unfit for Christian burial. Then they tossed him into the Tiber River, a rather undignified ending for a pope, though one imagines he wasn't too fussed about it at that point. The Cadaver Synod is one of those moments in history where you just have to pause and say, really, this was the best use of everyone's time. But it tells us a lot about the chaos of the era. The papacy wasn't the serene, untouchable office we often imagine. It was entangled in local politics, noble rivalries, and sheer pettiness. If a family wanted revenge, they'd dig up a pope and humiliate him publicly. That was the level of spite we're dealing with. And here's the kicker, the whole thing backfired. People were horrified, even in a society accustomed to violence and spectacle. This was a step too far. The sight of a pope's corpse being desecrated in front of the clergy shocked Romans. Stephen VI's reputation plummeted. Within a year, he was deposed, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. Divine justice, perhaps, or just karmic irony. Meanwhile, Formosus's body didn't stay in the Tiber. It was later recovered by sympathetic monks, reburied with respect, and eventually even re-honored by later popes. The Cadaver Synod was officially denounced as a grotesque mistake, though it remained the kind of mistake people whispered about for centuries. If you zoom out, the Cadaver Synod is a perfect microcosm of medieval power struggles. It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about truth. It was about rival factions trying to assert dominance, even if it meant making a literal corpse the centerpiece of their argument. Politics reduced to theater, and in a strange way, it's also a reminder of how medieval people blurred the line between the living and the dead. Corpses weren't just remains. They carried symbolic weight. A dead pope could still be tried, condemned, stripped of power, because his body represented authority. As long as he existed, even in death, his enemies felt threatened. Now, I don't know about you, but imagining this entire scene, the corpse on the throne, the pope yelling at him, the bishops nervously nodding, is both absurd and oddly sleep-inducing. Like some grotesque puppet show where everyone takes it far too seriously. So, as you drift further into the pillows, maybe picture that surreal courtroom. Candles flicker, bishops whiffer. The air is heavy with incense, and unfortunately, decomposition. And at the center sits poor Formasus, silent, unblinking, and if corpses could roll their eyes, probably wondering what on earth these people thought they were doing. In the end, history moves on. The Cadaver Synod faded into legend, an embarrassing footnote in church chronicles, but it lingers as one of those delightful reminders that the past wasn't just grand and solemn. It was messy, weird, and sometimes downright absurd, which honestly makes it feel a lot more human. And with that, we'll gently close the coffin lid on this strange little episode. Rest well. Formosus, you've done more for bedtime history than you ever did in life. So, we've finished our stroll. With Watchmen, we've drained our bitter penny coffee. We've swallowed our blessed cheese. And we've watched a pope's corpse get dragged through court, which, let's be honest, is already quite a lot for one bedtime session. But before you drift off entirely, let's slide into one more theme that always gets whispered about in history corners: royal inbreeding. Yes, tonight's lullaby is the saga of Europe's most genetically confused monarchs. Because nothing says sleep well like imagining kings and queens who married their cousins so often that family trees eventually looked more like tangled phone cords. Now, here's the thing. Royals were obsessed with keeping it in the family, and not in a creepy soap opera way, but in a political way. Marrying your cousin meant your lands stayed united. Your titles didn't leak out to rival families, and you didn't have to bother negotiating with strangers, which to medieval nobles sounded like far too much work. The result, centuries of dynasties that basically treated Europe like one giant family reunion, where everyone kept sneaking off to marry their first cousin. The most infamous example, of course, is the Habsburgs. Ah yes, the proud rulers of Spain, Austria, and half of Europe at one point. Their family motto might as well have been, "Why shop for spouses when you've already got a cousin at home?" Over generations, they married each other so frequently that by the 17th century, the results were noticeable. Enter Charles II of Spain, sometimes nicknamed the Bewitch. Charles was the unfortunate product of roughly 200 years of cousin-on-cousin matrimony. His family tree had fewer branches than a broomstick. He had the classic Habsburg jaw, so pronounced it looked like you could shelve books on it. He struggled with speech, drooled constantly, and was said to be barely able to chew food. Doctors at the time described him as unable to eat or walk properly, which is not exactly the kind of Yelp review you want as a king. Charles was also chronically sick, epileptic, and not surprisingly, infertile. His poor wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, once complained that he spent their wedding night staring blankly and muttering prayers instead of, well, you know, the man was 20 years old, but physically resembled someone far older, and mentally was often described as childlike. Spain's entire empire rested on him producing an heir. Spoiler, he did not. The dynasty collapsed, all because the Habsburgs thought it was more important to keep their bloodlines pure than, functioning. But Charles wasn't the only one. Let's float back a little to the English Plantagenets, who had their own cousin marrying habits. The royal houses of Lancaster and York intermarried so much during the late Middle Ages that by the time the Wars of the Roses broke out, most claimants to the throne were all cousins anyway. The whole Civil War was basically one extended family argument that got a little too stabby. Then there's the Ptolemies of Egypt. Yes, Cleopatra's family. These were Greek-descended monarchs ruling Egypt after Alexander the Great, and they took sibling marriage to a whole new level. Cleopatra herself was the product of several generations of brother-sister unions. In her family, the words royal wedding and awkward family dinner were basically the same thing. To them, it wasn't taboo, it was tradition. Egyptian pharaohs had married siblings for centuries to preserve divine bloodlines, and the Ptolemies just ran with it. Of course, the downside of centuries of inbreeding is fairly obvious. Health issues, strange physical traits, infertility, and occasional bouts of mental instability, which, when you're ruling empires, is not ideal. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your king can't walk straight. Your queen is both his niece and his cousin, and the heir is currently drooling into his ceremonial robes. Sleep tight. Subject. But perhaps the saddest part of this royal inbreeding saga is how deliberate it was. They genuinely believed they were preserving purity, when in fact they were slowly reducing their dynasties into fragile glass figurines. Beautiful, yes, but brittle, breakable, and often cracked beyond repair. Let's take another quiet example. Joanna of Castile, better known as Joanna the Mad. Now, to be fair, historians debate whether Joanna was truly mentally unstable or just politically sidelined by men around her, but the fact remains. Her family was the Habsburg dynasty. Her husband was Philip the handsome by medieval standards, which often meant has hair and teeth, and her children included Charles V, yet another Habsburg who juggled empires and jaw deformities at the same time. Joanna herself was deeply in love with Philip, to the point of obsession. When he died young, she reportedly traveled with his embalmed body, refusing to bury him, convinced he might rise again. Some call that devotion, others call it a breakdown. Either way, it didn't help the dynasty's reputation for instability. And yes, inbreeding probably didn't help with the emotional fragility running through that family. What makes all of this so soothingly absurd, when you tell it at bedtime, is how normal it seemed at the time. To us, it's bizarre. To them, it was strategy. Cousins married cousins. Siblings wed siblings. And entire empires were built on the idea that you didn't want to dilute your bloodline with anyone too exotic. Ironically, their obsession with purity often led to dynastic extinction. So, if you're lying there in bed right now, cozy and drifting, maybe imagine a medieval royal family tree. The branches don't spread outward, they curl inward, looping back on themselves like a poorly drawn spiral. Faces repeat, names repeat, and somewhere at the bottom sits poor Charles II of Spain, drooling onto his throne, struggling to chew his dinner, while courtiers pretend everything is perfectly fine. Because after all, he was God's chosen king. Sure, if God had a dark sense of humor. In the end, royal inbreeding stands as one of those historical lessons humanity quietly absorbed. Maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't marry your first cousin 6 generations in a row. But for centuries, Europe's monarchies did exactly that, leaving us with some of the strangest, saddest, and most oddly fascinating rulers in history. And as a bedtime story, it works surprisingly well. Because if you can picture a court full of fragile royals with oversized jaws and delicate health, it's hard not to feel a little more grateful for your own ordinary, unroyal, non-inbred family tree. So far, tonight we've followed lantern-carrying watchmen, bickering coffee drinkers, nervous cheese eaters, a dead pope on trial, and the most inbred monarchs Europe had to offer. At this point, you might be wondering, what about the kids? Because behind every drooling, jaw-heavy Habsburg or scheming Plantagenet, there were royal children being raised with all the tender warmth and stability of a cold stone castle. Let's be honest, medieval royal childhood was less about toys and bedtime stories, and more about survival, politics, and occasionally tuberculosis. Most royal children were either sickly little bundles of dynastic hope, or spoiled brats raised on the delusion that the world revolved around them. And sometimes, they managed to be both at once. Take, for example, the young princes of England. Being born into the Plantagenet or Tudor household might sound glamorous, but in reality, it was terrifying. Infant mortality was high. Even kings and queens buried children constantly. Henry VIII, for instance, famously obsessed over producing a healthy son because so many of his earlier children died. His daughter Mary was sickly and often treated like fragile glass. His beloved son Edward the Sexy made it to the throne, only to die at age 15, leaving England scrambling. Being a royal child meant being the center of everyone's plans, and yet at constant risk of not living long enough to carry them out. And when they did survive, well, they were often spoiled in ways that made them completely unfit for real life. Imagine being a 5-year-old prince in a castle where grown men bow to you, tutors fawn over your genius because you managed to spell your name, and servants rush to bring you candied almonds whenever you pout. By the time you're 12, you genuinely believe you're God's gift to humanity, which, to be fair, is exactly what everyone tells you, until of course you inherit the throne and promptly run your kingdom into the ground. The Habsburg children are another tragic case. Remember Charles II of Spain from last part. His childhood was essentially one long medical file. He was breastfed until the age of 4 because his jaw wouldn't let him chew properly. Tutors described him as weak in body and spirit, which is a polite way of saying he was more interested in staring into space than learning Latin. His childhood wasn't filled with playtime or carefree days. It was doctors, priests, and endless prayers that he might someday somehow produce an heir. Spoiler, he didn't. But not all royal children were sickly. Some were spoiled to the point of absurdity. French princes in the 17th century were so indulged that courtiers treated even their tantrums as charming. One ambassador described young Louis XIV as being fed pastries whenever he cried, which might explain why he grew up into a king who thought building Versailles during an economic crisis was a totally reasonable idea. And then there were the unlucky spares. You've probably heard the phrase, the heir and the spare. Royal families loved having backups, just in case the firstborn died of plague or fell off a horse, or was poisoned at dinner. But the spare rarely had a happy life. They were raised in the shadow of the heir, important enough to be watched closely, but not important enough to matter in the long run. Some grew bitter, others rebelled. Many just wasted away, trapped in castles where every move was dictated by politics. For example, poor Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower. He was the younger brother, the spare. He and his brother Edward were locked in the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection, but of course they never came out. Their disappearance remains one of history's great mysteries. But it's a perfect reminder that royal childhood could end abruptly and tragically, especially if you were inconvenient to someone's claim to the throne. And what about education? You might imagine royal children being rigorously tutored, groomed for greatness. Sometimes, yes, they studied Latin, rhetoric, theology, maybe a bit of law. But often it was more about appearances than substance. They were told what to say, how to act, and how to bow in just the right way. Real curiosity was not encouraged. Nobody wanted a prince asking too many questions. After all, critical thinking was dangerous when your entire authority rested on divine right. Of course, childhood illnesses loomed over everything. Royal nurseries were breeding grounds for measles, smallpox, and whooping cough. Some children survived with scars, others didn't. Entire dynasties shifted because a single royal toddler failed to make it past their third birthday. We think of medieval and early modern monarchs as mighty figures, but in reality, their fates often hinged on the fragile lungs of a wheezing child. And then there's the strangest part. Many royal children weren't even raised by their parents. They were handed over to nurses, governesses, or entire households of servants. Kings and queens might see their kids occasionally, like exotic visitors passing through. Imagine growing up knowing your mother is a queen, but she only visits once a month. And when she does, it's to scold you for not standing up straight. Emotional intimacy wasn't exactly in fashion. Some, of course, turned out fine, or at least functional. Elizabeth I was a royal child who endured neglect, scandal, and constant threats, yet grew into one of England's greatest monarchs. But she was the exception, not the rule. For every Elizabeth, there were dozens of frail Edwards, fragile Joannas, or confused Charles stumbling their way through adulthood. So what do we make of royal childhood? On the surface it looks gilded, castles, servants, fine clothes. But under the surface it was lonely, fragile, and full of pressure. The children of kings and queens weren't playing with wooden toys in the mud. They were political pawns, their very existence tied to alliances and wars, and often they paid for it with their health, their happiness, or their sanity. If you're lying in bed right now, imagine yourself as one of those royal children, or in a drafty stone chamber, bundled in too many layers, listening to the distant toll of bells. Servants tiptoe around you, whispering about your health. Your tutor drones on about Latin declensions, and somewhere your parents are busy scheming about your marriage to some cousin in another kingdom. You're not really a child. You're a bargaining chip, a name on a treaty, a fragile body carrying the hopes of a dynasty. And as you drift off, you might think, maybe being a peasant kid, running around barefoot in the mud, wasn't so bad after all. At least you got to be a child, instead of a future headline in the annals of dynastic tragedy. So far, we've seen night watchmen stumble through London fog, jittery men in coffeehouses invent conspiracy theories, terrified villagers choke on blessed cheese, a dead pope dragged into court, royals who married their cousins one too many times, and children born into palaces that felt more like gilded prisons. At this point, you might be wondering, could it get any worse? Oh yes, it could. Because now we arrive at the grand finale, a few of the most dysfunctional kings and queens in history. Rulers so spectacularly bad at their jobs, or so utterly eccentric, that they make even modern politicians look like stable geniuses. Let's begin with Charles VI of France, known affectionately or not so affectionately as Charles the Med. He reigned in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a period already riddled with war and plague, so France really didn't need extra problems. Unfortunately, Charles provided plenty. At first, he seemed promising, young, energetic, and eager to rule. But then, the cracks began to show. Charles suffered from psychotic episodes, during which he believed bizarre things, most famously that he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He wore reinforced clothing to prevent himself from shattering, refused to be touched, and sat very carefully to avoid breaking. Imagine being a courtier trying to bow respectfully while your king whispers, "Don't come too close, or I might crack." Awkward. Sometimes Charles forgot who he was altogether. He once ran screaming through the forest, attacking his own men in a frenzy. Another time, he insisted he wasn't the king at all, just a poor peasant, which honestly might have been the most accurate thing he ever said. His reign was so chaotic that France spiraled deeper into the 100 Years' War, and his bouts of madness left the government in the hands of squabbling nobles. Dysfunctional? Definitely. Sleep-inducing? Absolutely. Now drifting eastward, let's meet Ivan I of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. And yes, he earned that nickname. Ivan started out okay, instituting reforms, strengthening the state, and building cathedrals like St. Basil's in Moscow. But then he slid into paranoia, violence, and fits of rage. He created the Oprichnina, a secret police force that terrorized anyone he suspected of treason. Spoiler, that was almost everyone. He was notorious for outbursts. Once during an argument, he struck his own son in the head with a staff, killing him, which is not the best fatherly behavior. Russia under Ivan became a place of fear, executions, and instability, all while the Tsar himself swung wildly between bouts of religious devotion and violent tantrums. Imagine trying to fall asleep at night in 16th century Moscow, knowing your ruler might wake up tomorrow and decide to burn down half the city. Cozy dream. But dysfunction didn't always mean violence. But sometimes it just meant being spectacularly unfit for the throne. Take Queen Joanna of Naples in the 14th century. She was accused, perhaps unfairly, perhaps not, of arranging the murder of her first husband, then went on to marry 3 more times, each match more scandalous than the last. Her reign was marked by intrigue, lawsuits, invasions, and a general sense of soap opera drama. She ruled for decades, but her personal life kept the rumor mill turning non-stop. Or look at Christian VII of Denmark in the 18th century. Christian was troubled. He became king as a teenager and quickly gained a reputation for bizarre behavior. He slapped people randomly, laughed at funerals, and engaged in endless practical jokes that no one found funny. He was also obsessed with certain, shall we say, solitary habits, which he indulged in excessively, worrying the court doctors. Real governance, not so much. His reign might have been a total disaster if not for his physician, Johan Struensee, who basically took over running Denmark behind the scenes. Struensee implemented reforms and also started an affair with the Queen, which, shockingly, ended badly. The scandal resulted in Struensee's execution, the Queen's exile, and Christian being left to, well, keep being dysfunctional. And finally, let's float gently to Spain again, where dysfunction practically became a family heirloom. Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king, was prone to depression and breakdown. He sometimes refused to change his clothes for weeks, insisted on strange rituals, and preferred hunting to ruling. Later in life, he grew so withdrawn that his second wife basically governed for him, not exactly the image of regal strength. What all these rulers have in common is that their personal struggles became national problems. In a modern democracy, a dysfunctional leader might get voted out, impeached, or at least yelled at on social media. But in a monarchy, you were stuck with them until death. If your king thought he was made of glass, well, guess what? So did your entire government. So, as you sink deeper into your pillows, picture these dysfunctional monarchs. Charles VI, carefully avoiding sudden movements so he wouldn't shatter. Ivan the Terrible, glaring suspiciously at everyone in sight. Christian VII, laughing inappropriately at solemn occasions. Philip V, refusing to get dressed while Spain muddled along without him. They were kings and queens, yes, but also fragile, flawed, deeply human people. And that, oddly enough, is what makes them soothing bedtime company. Because while their reigns were disasters, their stories remind us that history isn't just about battles and treaties. It's also about people, strange, broken, dysfunctional people, stumbling through power the same way the rest of us stumble through life. So, if you're still awake, and let's be honest, you might not be, let this final image lull you. A royal throne, gilded and ornate, occupied not by a great statesman or a fierce warrior, but by someone convinced they're made of glass, or someone too lazy to change their socks, or someone marrying their cousin for the 4th time. History is full of dysfunction, which makes it, oddly enough, the perfect bedtime story. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.